Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be popular books that I didn't think lived up to the hype. And just so you know, these are books that I read from beginning to end. They're not DNFs. And I apologize in advance if any of these are your favorite books. They just didn't work for me. The first book I wanted to talk to you about is The Final Empire in the Mistborn series. So obviously quite a fat book and pretty popular in the fantasy genre. I just didn't think this book did much for me. So it's a story about this girl. She's really poor. I believe she's in the section of society called the Scar, until she meets this enigmatic man called Kelsia, and they basically have this plan along with this cast of characters to pull off a heist. There's like this Dark Lord sort of character, and he's basically kept society in this way where he has all the power. The poor people are really poor, and this world has this magic that I believe it's called allomancy. It revolves around metals, and she's learning about her powers. So she's a Mistborn, so a lot of people in this world have powers relating to certain metals, but hers, she can basically take advantage of many metals, and people in this world are scared of someone like that or distrustful of them. The reason I didn't like this book very much was because firstly the size. I didn't think it had to be this long. It dragged at places. Then another thing was it's not that I didn't like the magic system, I like the idea of it. It just got confusing. There are parts where they explain like what happens with this metal, and there's a section at the back of the book that has notes on like what happens with each metal, so you can keep up with it. But it was just extremely hard for me to visualize some of it. I didn't feel too much of a connection with the main character, so I felt like I was sort of at arm's length with this book in general. And I also wasn't a fan of the ending. If you read this, you know what happens, and that happening just made me not really want to read the rest of the books in this series. And when I read what the other books were about, it just felt like a task, like a track, a journey I didn't want to be on. The second book is a classic, Pride and Prejudice. It took me so long to read this because, again, I was just not engaged with the book. I found it quite boring. I found the language hard to get accustomed to. I know people say Jane Austen's a good place to start with classics, and she might be, but I just don't know if classics from this time are for me. I prefer modern classics. And I know people might say like you just didn't understand the book, blah blah blah, but I guess I kind of forced myself to read it, like continue reading it when I shouldn't have done. Just didn't really care about the relationship between, I know this is so controversial, between Lizzie Bennet and Darcy. Then we have The Silent Patient by Alex Michaelides. It's basically about this woman who shot her husband. She doesn't speak again, she goes silent, so it's about our main character speaking to her, trying to figure out what happened. I believe he might be a therapist or a psychologist or something like that. This one, I will admit, it was addictive. He does that thing where at the end of each chapter it's almost like a mini cliffhanger and then you want to keep going. The reason I didn't like this book in hindsight is because firstly the plot twist, it just felt like cheap or lazy to me. So if you've read The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie, I mean that's going to be a spoiler for this book, but if you've read that and you know the reveal, then you've already seen that sort of reveal done before, that sort of plot twist done before, and so it just didn't really surprise me in this book. Other than that, I also feel like if the author is throwing in red herrings, things to get you suspicious of certain characters, I think once the reveal is done and we know, you know, the plot twist, I think at least after that they should sort of tie those strings up, you know, explain why this character was acting suspiciously. So what were they actually doing in those suspicious moments? Like, it just feels sort of cheap to throw in red herrings like that just for the sake of creating suspicion. Next is a YA romance book called Red, White and Royal Blue. It's about the romance between the first son of the president of the US and then the Prince of England. I don't think it had to be this long. Parts of it were just boring, or I didn't think it added much to the plot. I didn't feel like they showed us that much of the build up to this relationship. It just feels like the author wanted two people to be together and then they were together. I don't think a good enough job was done to show me like the emotional attraction between them. I think I saw it more with the Prince of England, I've forgotten his name, Prince Henry. I saw it more with him. I couldn't see the other way around as much. It's not a memorable romance to me. Then we have His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. This is a middle grade, although reading it, I feel like the language is so complex for middle grade, but I do think the writing was really good. It's basically about Lyra, and in this world, each person has a demon, so an animal, which is like an extension of their soul. Lyra's friend is kidnapped, and it basically, she lives in Oxford, and the story follows on from there. So she goes on this journey to help try and find her friend. Some horrific things are happening, and I also don't know how I felt about the ending of this book. Again, it almost ends in a cliffhanger, and that's okay, but after reading this and, you know, the end, you learn a bit more about what was happening. Had no interest in continuing on with the series. This book uses science, or like made up science, to like explain some of the events, and I don't know, some of the concepts, maybe because they were made up, it was just like hard for me to grasp. Maybe as a kid I would have been more accepting of what they were telling me, but I was like trying to visualize or understand what the science was, and just didn't make sense to me. Then we have The Trials of Morrigan Crow in the Nevermoor series. So this is, I guess, somewhat of a Harry Potter type of book. So there's this girl, Morrigan Crow, on her 11th birthday, I think. Yeah, she is cursed to die. But then this guy called Jupiter North swoops in and takes her away to this land called Nevermoor. She basically has to go through these trials to join the this wondrous society, and I like the idea of that. It's sort of like Hogwartsy, if in a way. There's this, I guess, a parallel to a Lord Voldemort type character. There's this whole cast of like quirky characters, like a talking cat, and just the whole city, or the world in general, is very like quirky. It sort of feels like that chosen one trope where the main character is really hard on themselves, but I don't know, the world was a bit too quirky for me, to the point where I feel like it kept me at a distance from the characters or the book. I guess I didn't feel like that sense of warmth to the world. Like with Harry Potter, if you think about Hogwarts, like you want to go to Hogwarts, you want to live there. Whereas with this world, I didn't have like any interest in actually being in the world, if that makes sense. Then we have this one, maybe the most controversial one, The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. I will admit this story was captivating. It basically follows Evelyn Hugo, a Hollywood star, and she gets married 7 times. So it goes through her journey, each of her husbands, why their relationship didn't work out and what their relationship was like. You know, even if you look at the cover of this book, it just gives me like the vibe of, you know, that gilded age of just Hollywood glamour. And I just don't think if you actually read the book you see enough of that. Maybe it was the writing style as well, it didn't lend itself to those sort of descriptions. The other thing that didn't make sense to me was, so the story is basically about this reporter, Monique Grant, who is basically meeting with Evelyn and learning about her story for like a newspaper, a magazine article, something like that. firstly, I didn't see the point of that part of the story. I think that part of the story, having Monique in it, just served a purpose or for like a plot twist or like a reveal. I think we could have just heard Evelyn's story without a reporter being there. And the last reason I didn't like this book is the main character, Evelyn. I didn't find her very likable. I know she went through a lot. She had hardships in her life, but I don't think that excuses the bad decisions she made, the people she hurt. I get it, like maybe she's meant to be a great character, but I just found it hard to sympathize with her when she kept making bad decisions or hurting people she loved. And then one other book I wanted to talk about that I no longer have the physical copy of because I donated it is Finlay Donovan is Killing It. So that book basically follows Finlay Donovan, a single mom, and she is at a Panera, at a restaurant basically, and she's an author, so she's talking about her book and the plot in her book and how someone's gonna die and someone overhears her and thinks she's a hit woman, so they want to hire her as a hit woman to kill their husband. I guess the real reason I didn't like that one is I read Dial A for Aunties by Jessie Sutanto. I read that one first and that book was so funny. I was engaged for most of the way through. It wasn't like one of my favorite books ever, but I did enjoy the reading experience, I think, as well, because it follows Asian characters and this girl's aunties, and I just found culturally a lot of similarities with my culture and, you know, how relatives in my culture act or speak, and so I found that book a lot more relatable. But it's a similar sort of premise of someone being killed by accident, you know, that kind of story. And so reading this one, Finlay Donovan was Killing It, after that, it was just sort of a letdown. Like, it wasn't nearly as good as Dial A for Aunties to me. So yeah, if you think you're reading Finlay Donovan is Killing It, I mean, you might enjoy it, but I would recommend Dial A for Aunties instead. Okay, and then the last three books are graphic novels. So let's start with this one. I know it's super popular, so Saga Volume 1. Basically about this couple. I think there's two sort of groups of people or races in this world, and they're enemies, but this man and this woman have a baby together and they're from opposing sections of society. It's sort of like a sci-fi set in space. They're from different planets, I think. There's a chase to catch them and their baby because they've committed treason or whatever. I know this is just volume 1, so maybe it gets better, but from what I've read of volume 1, I have no incentive to read volume 2. Characters, I didn't feel connected to them, any of them really. Parts of the book were like overly sexualized, parts didn't necessarily make sense. I feel like, you know, you keep meeting these different species or whatever of characters, and I don't know, it just feels sort of one after another without much background. Something I don't like about graphic novels is, you know, I understand why they're short. I guess that's how comics have typically been as well. But with a story like this, it's almost like I get nothing in this amount of pages. It's like I just about get into the world and then it ends without much happening. The last one I have is Nimona. I think when people make videos about graphic novel recommendations, I often see this one recommended. It's basically about this girl, Nimona, and she becomes a sidekick to a supervillain called Lord Blackheart. They basically want to prove that this man called Sir Goldenloin and this institution of law enforcement in this city or world aren't the heroes they think they are. And so Nimona develops this companionship with Lord Blackheart, and their relationship is cute to see. I just feel like not much happened in it. I don't know, I just didn't really feel a connection to Nimona, or I felt more of a connection to Lord Blackheart. I almost feel like I wish we followed him instead. I feel like we hear about Nimona's past. I feel like we could have gone into more detail about that. But, maybe this book is for YA or, you know, slightly younger audience, but I don't know, for me, given the amount of hype this book gets, it just didn't do it for me. But yeah, that's all for today. Thank you so much for being here and watching this video. I would love if you would subscribe to the video and like it if you enjoyed it. But yeah, that's all for today. I hope to see you again very soon. Thank you.